welcome to the Lane Motor Museum here in Nashville, Tennessee. My name is Derek Moore and I am the Curator of Collections. And here today to talk about the history of Tatra vehicles with you. But a little background on the museum first. We're located, as I said, here in Nashville, Tennessee, and we're a little unique in the world of automotive museums, at least in the United States, as we actually hold one of the largest European collection of vehicles outside of the continent of Europe. And one of the largest collections of those marked vehicles that we have is our Tatra collection. Now, Tatra is a very interesting company in the history of the automobile across the world. They were very advanced in their engineering and design work, and that all goes back to the very beginning of the company in 1850. When it was Skoda and Company. Skoda was a blacksmith and settled on land that his brother owned in the Nesselsdorf area. And he began his company there, building wagons and other horse-drawn vehicles and making repairs to those type of vehicles as well. As time went on, he became very well known for the wagons and other vehicles he was manufacturing, so much so that in the 1870s they were invited to display the vehicles at the World's Fair in Vienna. That brought a major amount of attention to the company, and orders started coming in almost at a rate that was very difficult to handle. So Skoda and Company continued to grow into the 1890s when they actually would incorporate and become the Nesselsdorf Company, actually the Nesselsdorf Wagon Fabrication Company, and would start building Nesselsdorf vehicles. Now, in 1897, as they continue to grow and see that the automobile industry in Europe is starting to blossom, if you will, with things like, or companies like Benz and Daimler coming very quickly into popularity, they decide that they need to get into the automobile manufacturing world as well, and they begin with a vehicle in late 1897 known as the President. And that is the first vehicle they build, and importantly, when they're building this vehicle, they hire a young 19-year-old gentleman who comes in as a kind of an apprentice engineer, has a great background growing up with a father that is in the trades, and that gentleman's name is Hans Ladvinka. And Hans will kind of be the impetus of major change within the company as the years go by. Now, Hans is involved in the very first car, the President, in building it and working with the team there that actually develops that car and engineers it. And he will go on to engineer the vehicles and be involved in the design of the vehicles for the next about 7 to 8 years before he has a disagreement with the company and heads off to kind of work in the automobile industry in other areas, including Paris, France, working on steam engines. But then in 1905, he returns to the company when they're falling on hard times. And he comes in and he brings kind of new ideas to the company in, rather than building kind of smaller vehicles, they build somewhat large luxury vehicles that are entitled the Model S, the Model T, and the Model U. Now, these vehicles go into production and start being built, but Hans yet again has another disagreement with the company and departs for a few years, actually goes off to the ironworks that would eventually build the vehicle known as the Steyr. And we actually have a few Steyrs here in the collection that Ladvinka was involved in obviously designing and working on. But as the company over at Nesselsdorf continues to build the Model S, T, and U, they get into the pre-production days of the Model U and decide they need to test the vehicle somewhere other than the general location around Nesselsdorf. And they send their chief engineer at the time along with a team from the factory, and they direct them to head towards the Tatra Mountains. Now, at this time, the company is still called Nesselsdorf, so the vehicles that are coming out are simply known as the Nesselsdorfs, the Nesselsdorf T, U, so on and so forth, much like the Ford here in America had those model names. And they get to the Tatra Mountains, and they eventually make their way into the mountainous region, winding up in one of the small towns where they hear a comment that no other vehicle had ever, self-propelled vehicle, automobile, had ever made it that far into the mountains during the winter, through about 6-foot snow drifts, deep snow, and basically what would be considered to most of the time impassable roads. And one of the folks in the town uttered a comment that, wow, that's really a vehicle for the Tatra Mountains. The team that was testing the vehicles took that story back with them, and the company would actually decide to change the name from Nesselsdorf to Tatra. And you'll see here the early Tatra logo on one of our vehicles, a simple round badge with the Tatra name in the center. Now, it's not long after the name Tatra comes into the company and the Model U is in production that Nesselsdorf, now Tatra, starts to again fall on difficult times. The automobile industry is struggling. Large vehicles that cost a lot of money after World War I, right around that World War I period, aren't really selling well, and you can imagine why. So they bring Hans Lodvinka back. And Hans had been working out ideas for automobiles ever since he left. And while he was at Steyr, he was coming up with ideas for their future line of vehicles. But when they bring him back to basically take over the automobile production side of the company and build these Tatras, Hans Lodvinka brings a whole new idea with him. An idea that had not really been seen in the automobile industry at the time, and that is a very small and simply designed air-cooled engine vehicle. And it's designed around what we would call a backbone chassis. Now what that is a chassis that simply has the engine and transmission up front, basically what we call a torque tube, or a tube that the drive shaft runs through to the rear axle, and then the rear axle mounted at the back of the vehicle. And that is actually all that creates the chassis. There's no framework around it. It's a rigid unit that the body can be built on top of. And that is the new line of Tatras that will be introduced under Hans' leadership. And they will be, again, known as the T series of Tatras. So rather than the Nesselsdorf T that we already had, he's going to go back and come up with the Tatra Model T, starting out with the T11 and T12s. And what you see here beside me today is a T12 that has actually been turned into a replica of one of the Targa Florio race cars that Tatra actually raced in the Targa Florio race. They were actually fairly successful in the races, proving that the new Tatra vehicle with this new design was actually a very successful car that could withstand really the difficult conditions that the Targa Florio presented to the cars that were racing in it. They were just fantastic cars, very durable, very rugged, and really more importantly, the vehicles that were being sold to the public were going to be more affordable than the higher end large Nesselsdorf automobiles that company had been building prior to the introduction of this T series of automobiles. The T11 and T12 were really out early in the 1920s, the mid 1920s, and then as the company evolves, they kind of keep the same platform for a number of years. What we call that backbone chassis design, very similar look to the front ends here. Obviously, you can see kind of that very kind of flat V'd front nose, and a very interesting front end that actually the hood pivots up on the whole front end, and it gives you access to that typically horizontally opposed two-cylinder air-cooled engine. And this is a Tatra T57 that we have in the collection. Obviously, they're working kind of their way up through a number series rather than changing the letters in designating the models of the automobiles that they are building. Now, during the production of the T57 and some of the other early T cars, actually in the early 1930s, Hans Ladvinka and the team were actually working on a completely new design. They were moving away from the backbone chassis design and really moving to a more full, what we would think of as a full frame design vehicle, and eventually would evolve into what we today would call the unit body construction or unitized frame and body construction. And interestingly, the two cars that flank me right now were built in the same exact year, 1938. This is a 1938 T57B, so kind of the second series of the T57 we looked at earlier. But here, this beautiful red car, we have a Tatra T97. And this is really the important moment in Tatra history. The introduction in 1934 of the T77 model was the introduction of the world's first serial-produced aerodynamic designed car. Hans Ladvinka and the team had studied a gentleman named Paul Jarre's design work and studies around the aerodynamics of the Zeppelin airships in Germany, and had come up with a way to design a streamlined automobile. Now, on the floor right now, as I said, we have our T97. This is actually an air-cooled four-cylinder car. This is kind of the smallest of the aerodynamic cars that Tatra produced. The T87, which we will show you an image of, along with the T87, the T77, and the T97 are the three cars. The T77 and T87 have air-cooled V8 engines in them. So they were a little more powerful cars, and just interestingly, the T87 was actually one of the favorite cars of German officers during World War II. It was known actually as, designed and known as a car for the Autobahn. And that's actually what the car that saved Tatra from being completely shut down by the German armies during World War II, because they were producing one of the favorite cars of that of the army. So aerodynamics are huge for Tatra. They're, as I say, the first company to come out with any type of aerodynamic styling in an automobile in a production, serial production method. So as time goes on, of course, the company needs to evolve and bring out new models. They don't want to be just stuck with one model of automobile. Unfortunately, World War II, because of the Germans' interest in the T87, and they're allowing the company to continue production, eventually Hans Ladvinka is found guilty of cooperating with the German army during World War II and is actually sentenced to imprisonment. After he is released from prison, Tatra actually tries to get him to come back, but he does not agree to go back to the company and kind of lives his life out in retirement after that. But the company carries on with some of his, let's say, proteges at the helm, and they come up with the T600, or the Tatraplan. And this is one of our T600s here in the collection. This is actually a fantastic car in our collection because it is actually an unrestored T600. So you're actually seeing a T600 as it would have come straight out of the Tatra factory, other than its age and use of dings and dents and scratches and things like that. But seeing exactly how the interior was put together, the dashboard, the carpets, the floor mats, all of that is still intact in this car, and it really helps you understand the quality that Tatra was building these vehicles to, because you can see this is a very nice interior, very nice stitching. They were not building some cheap necessarily car for the masses at this point. Now they were building very quality, high-end, well-engineered, designed cars that could be used in Europe and, of course, on the Autobahn. Now, as I say, any automobile company does not want to get left behind in design and styling. As you see with the T600, you see this, what we might call vestilage fin, or small remainder of that larger fin that you saw in the 77, 87, and 97 series. That was part of that aerodynamic styling and stabilization of the car. But it still gave that aged look to the vehicle, something that they had been producing in previous years. So eventually, by the late 1950s, they come up with a whole new design for the Tatra automobile, known as the T603. And that's the vehicle you see sitting here, this beautiful two-tone red and kind of cream-toned sedan. Now, interestingly, Tatra was a strong believer in the rear-engine vehicles, so this is still a rear-engine V8, air-cooled V8, and really made for a well-balanced automobile. It made the car handle well, and of course the V8 power made it a powerful vehicle to drive around Europe, and the Autobahns and all of that was so important to the countries. This specific Tatra 603 is extremely important in the history of the company because this is the actual 1958 Geneva show car. So this is the car that was on display on the show stand at the Geneva Auto Show in 1958, and it's really one of the prized cars in the collection here at the museum because of that significance of being the show car. One of the interesting things too that you'll see with the Tatra 603 is these three headlights across the front. This actually harkens back to some of the aerodynamic vehicles, the T87 and 87 and 77, that had three headlights across the front. So this was a little bit of a throwback to that time period. The T97 did not receive that because of its smaller scale and stature. It just had the dual headlight setup. And then as the company kind of went on, they tried to become a more modern automobile company. After the 603, they had a car called the T613, which was really their move into, as I say, the modern automobile. It was actually designed by the Italian coach building company Vignali, and it was actually quite popular in Europe for a while, but Tatra really started to focus their company on building their trucks and truck design, and so the 613 eventually would, production of that car would slow down, sales would slow, and the company would end the production of the 613 and move into their final automobile, the T700, and that is the beautiful maroon vehicle you see sitting here. As you can see by looking at this, this actually looks a bit like the T613, more modernized than that car, but you can really see for the 1990s, this is a 1996 Tatra T700. This is a very modern automobile, and as I say through this whole talk, that is what Tatra was about, being on the cutting edge of design and engineering with the vehicles they were building, and they didn't let that fade away in their last automobile that they would produce. Now, interestingly, only about 75 of these T700s were built, and we are fortunate enough to have one in the collection. So, we have a number of other Tatras in the collection. Hopefully, some of you will make it to visit the Lane Motor Museum in the future, and we'll have some of, we always rotate the Tatras. You'll kind of see a different one every time you're here. But I thank you for spending this time with me, learning about our Tatra collection here at the museum. And I hope you've enjoyed the tour. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me.